Hi, everyone, and welcome to your first screencast from me with the post-COVID suspension. I hope everybody did okay and are prepared to move forward here. So this is the first one of what will be this week's information. This is in regards to stretching and strengthening PNF and so forth. So just follow this through, and I have created a discussion board for you to ask any questions in regard to this material or anything else that's going on. So just keep in mind that I'm available, and there'll be discussions around this content if at all possible as you move through all of this stuff. Okay? All right. So what is kinesiology? I do know that some of you here are kinesiologists or phys ed graduates. You may understand what this is, but a lot of you, this is new to you in terms of what kinesiology is. So what do you think kinesiology is? It is the study of human movement from a point of view of the physical sciences. So we look at a human body from physical science such as physics, and we start to determine what kind of movements occur. Kinesiology basically is the study of human movement. So we're sort of taking a look at it. It is the study of the human body as a machine for the performance of work. Although formally we may use in the identification of work as what you think of as work, it also has to do with everything else that we do in our lives. Could be playing a sport. It could be functional requirements of a type of job that you have. It could be the functional requirements that you need to do working in the house every day or whatever is required of you. So don't think of work just as work, but it's looking at all the things the human body does functionally, determining that as work, and then understanding from a machine perspective of levers and pulleys and so forth, how the body works or how the body moves to perform these tasks. So through this knowledge, you will be able to improve the performance of your patients. Again, the term performance, we tend to think about from a sports perspective. But performance, as I've said, is a lot of other things as compared to work. Can be things that are personal, all the way to things that are professional, things that we do for a living, and so forth. So this is an important slide because I want you to think about what I'm going to discuss here as part of what we do when we look at a patient and we assess them. I'm going to be talking a lot about this in the coming slide sets when we look at how do we create a prescription to increase flexibility? How do we create a prescription to make someone stronger or to have better aerobic capacity, right? What we need to do is we need to look at someone when they talk about having functional disability, or when we ask a patient what functionally they need to do, what are their activities of daily living. These four things are what we need to think about when we're asking those questions from an analysis point of view. So, a description of the motor skill performance. So when we ask what the motor skill is, or when we define what the motor skill is with ourselves in asking questions of our patients, what is the primary purpose of the skill that they require? What are the movement phases? What is occurring within that skill? Whether it's the lower body, the upper body, the trunk, the core, whatever it may be. What movements are occurring there? What classifications of the skill are happening? I'm going to talk about that a little bit further on here. What is the simultaneous or sequential nature of the motion? So what is happening from step 1 to step 10 in something needs to be done within this motor skill? The next thing we need to look at is the anatomical analysis of what's going on here in the movement. So what joint actions are happening and what segmental movements are happening within the requirement of the work or whatever it is that they're doing, the movement. The muscle participation in form of contraction. So what muscles need to contract? How do they need to contract to move these limbs, these parts of the limb through the joints to perform these tasks? Neuromuscular considerations. So what's happening at the neurological level to perform this work or these tasks? Anatomical principles related to effective and safe performance. So is there a safe or a effective way to perform the task that you know of that maybe your patient's not doing and may have led to the reason why they're seeing you? The third consideration of the analysis is mechanical analysis. So what is the underlying mechanics that need to occur to perform the task? What are the objectives that the patient's after to perform the task? The nature of forces causing or impeding motion. So when we look at the forces that need to be created to perform the tasks, what's impeding it or what's causing it. Mechanical principles that apply, which we're going to be talking a whole lot about in this set of slides. And then violation of the principles that we're talking about, these mechanical principles. So which application or applications of mechanical principles is or are violated when they're performing the task? What are the errors that are occurring mechanically when they're performing the tasks? What are the sources of the error? Could it be tightness in a muscle? Could it be scar tissue limiting? Could it be inappropriate neuromuscular conversation, like because they've had a stroke or something like that? And then the fourth part is prescriptions for improvement of performance indicate how the performance should be changed so that the principles are no longer violated. If anything at all from this slide, and I know this seems relatively large and overwhelming, but this is what you need to consider critically whenever anybody walks in the door with a problem, and the problem, its effect on how the patient is able to perform their work, their play, their home responsibilities, and so forth. This is a nice breakdown of what you need to be thinking about when the patient tells you how they have a problem and how you need to analyze it. So this analysis, the primary purpose of the skill, why do they need that skill? What is it within their work, play, or home life do they need to do this skill for? The classification of the skill. So is it independent living or work? Is it for health and play, or is it for near perfect performance? So we need to think about what is our classification here? Are we trying to make them more independent because maybe they've had a stroke and they can't function properly? We're suggesting that they're within their health and play, that by performing these tasks, their play will be better, their health will get better. Or are we actually working with an athlete who we're trying to train to perform their skill or their sport better? So when we look at this system for classification of these motor skills, we have to look at, are they maintaining good posture? Now, the first posture you're going to think about is standing up nice and tall, not leaned over. There's a lot of postures that are required. Posture is very much a fluid term for a lot of different things. The posture of the way you stand, the posture of the way you sit, the posture when you throw a baseball, the posture when you're skiing down a hill. There's a number of them. So you have to think about how do you maintain good posture for the requirement of that skill or work. Movement for exercise and fitness is another thing for classification. So are there good movements that are required for exercise and fitness? The next thing we analyze is giving motion. So are they external objects? In other words, is the patient required to push or pull anything, a wheelbarrow, a cart, a shopping cart, whatever it might be? Are they having to throw, strike, or kick? Or it could be even reaching out and pulling levers and so forth. So we're looking at what we'll eventually learn about is open chain movements. Are they required to do these sorts of things? Are they moving just their own body? Are they having to move themselves through whatever's happening? Could be even a sport, sprint or whatever. Are they suspended and free of support in whatever it is they're supposed to be doing? Are they supported by water? So are they working within that kind of thing? Remember, within this analysis, you're not only just looking at athletes, but you're also looking at day-to-day stuff. So some of these may not apply and seem a bit odd, but you could be working with athletes that require this as well. What about impact? What about within the work or the task they're doing? Is there impact? So is there impact just from jumping and landing on something, so one's own body? Are they having to catch or trap something or intercept something? Are they any full contact sport or a situation where there could be full contact on their body? These are just some of the things that we need to think about when we're analyzing what this patient does when we ask that, what kind of tasks do they perform. Simultaneous and sequential nature of motion. So what I mean by that is when we look at the standing long jump here, we can see in this diagram, see here that there are a number of movements that occur: the initiation, the start, the middle, and the landing. For this task, as the example being the standing long jump, for this task to happen properly, the sequential movements have to occur at the right time in the right place in order for the task to occur. In this case, the standing long jump, there has to be this preload and then movement into eventually the landing. This simultaneous sequential nature of motion can be anything besides just something like this. So there are movements that have to occur, maybe working on a line in Honda, building parts of cars. It could be that they're performing a task with that work. It could be that it's an athlete having to move through all the motions that have to occur when swinging a golf club, and so forth. So when we look at this sequential or simultaneous nature of motion, some things we need to think about. What joints are involved and what are their exact movements in the motor skill? So we have to sort of break it down. It is not uncommon to ask a patient to pretend that they're at work and ask them to move like they would at work, especially if you don't understand some of the things that they may be doing. Are there any of these joints used to the limit of their range of motion? Obviously, if a task requires a joint to move into the extreme end of its range, the potential for injury becomes quite high. Which muscles are responsible for the joint actions and what kind of contraction? So what muscles are concentrically contracting? What muscles are eccentrically contracting? Maybe there's some isometric contraction to stabilize a joint. So we need to start looking at what's happening, what muscles are working within the context of the skill being performed. Which neuromuscular mechanisms are likely to help or hinder the action? So remember, when we look at muscular contraction, that is a stimulatory message that's sent for a muscle to contract. But conversely, the agonist to the primary muscle, the nervous system, also sends an inhibitory message that allows for the full range to occur. So we have to, again, break it down and look at it. Now, if I go back just for a moment to this, one thing that a lot of therapists use, and now with phones it works great, although we do have to keep privacy in mind, and that is, when you're looking at a patient do these things, it may be a good idea to actually film them, or video them, I guess that's an old-fashioned term, to film, to video them, slow it down, have a look at it, which may help you start to break down what's happening. The more practice you get at this, the easier it will be for you to start looking at what muscles are affected, what joints are moving, what direction they're moving, what end of range they're in, and so on and so forth. So through practice, you will get better at this. I'm not sure at this point if you've done gait analysis. I don't believe you have, but for sure next semester you will be. This will sort of be your first attempt at what we'll call a kinesiological analysis of movements. You'll start to look at how someone walks, determine what parts of that walking may not be functioning well, and then start asking yourself the question of what muscles may be the problem, whether tight or loose or weak or whatever, and moving through all this analytical, critical thinking to come up with maybe how to lengthen a muscle or strengthen a muscle to improve gait. So in moving forward then, we have to have some key sort of definitions when we're looking at kinesiologically studying someone or analysis. The first is motion. So in essence, what we're looking at is motion, whether that is motion of us moving along or pushing things or so forth. So the first one is called relative motion. So motion is the act or process of changing place or position with respect to some reference object. So we start in one place, we move to another. Now, what's interesting is it is possible to be at rest and in motion at the same time relative to different reference points. So, for example, we could be sitting in a plane sleeping, and yet there is motion because the plane is actually flying across the sky. We can compare two joggers who may be running at exactly the same pace. They may have motion along the road, but comparatively to each other, there is no difference in motion. They seem still in looking at each other. Whereas if one started running at a faster rate than the other, then you would denote motion. You know, what's of interest is, this is the reason why a lot of people when they drive fast, don't recognize they're driving fast because they're moving along with everybody else. And it gives your brain this false sense of lack of motion. And you don't really notice the speed you're going or the motion you're traveling when you're flying down the highway until you suddenly have to put your brakes on because something in front of you has come to a dead stop. And then you really start to quickly realize just how much motion you actually have. Whereas when you were comparing yourself to the cars around you, you didn't have that same sense of motion. So what form of motion is called translatory movement, which is what's called linear motion. And within that linear motion, there are two types. There is rectilinear motion and curvilinear motion. Rectilinear motion is like a child on a sled, which is a straight line progression of an object as a whole. So the child's lying on the sled is sliding forward. A curvilinear motion is a curved translatory motion. In other words, object moving in a curved pathway, such as when we deliver or we throw a bowling ball. So there is a curve to that delivery. The ball starts up high behind the body, and as we come through to release the ball, we come downwards, and when we release the ball, the arm comes back up again. That would be curvilinear in terms of motion. There is rotary or angular motion. So this is what we find typically with levers, wheels, and axles. An example of a rotary or angular motion in the body would be the kicking of a soccer ball. So what happens is the leg is a radius moving around a fixed point. So the hip joint would be the fixed point, and the foot flying through the air to make contact with the ball would be the radius moving. So within all this motion, you cannot have kinesiology without a gentleman by the name of Newton, who created some laws. And he created a lot of laws, and the three that pertain to us are the laws of motion. So Newton's first law of motion is the law of inertia. Quote unquote, a body continues in its state of rest or of uniform motion unless an unbalanced force acts upon it. So, any kind of object at rest stays at rest. You put a plate on the table, it stays there. A moving object moves along a straight line and at a constant speed until acted on by a force. So let's say you're floating in space and you're moving along. That won't change. Your line of movement will not change unless something else comes along to hit you or your hand reaches out to push against the wall. You have placed another force against the line you're moving and it changes. So for example, friction, gravity, or air resistance can change it. So when we hit a baseball, it gains this movement, this motion, and it is played upon by gravity and air resistance, which slows it down. If that wasn't there, it would just continue on that straight line and forward. So for example, having to change velocity when stealing a base to avoid overrunning the base. So we have to, through friction and gravity, as we run towards that second base, the body does have to make alterations so that we utilize the friction of the sand, such as sliding, to slow ourselves down to get into the base. Another example would be a car is moving along, it has to slam on the brakes, and the first thing you'll note is that you continue moving forward even though the car has stopped. The property of an object that causes it to remain in its state of either rest or motion is called its inertia. The greater the mass, the greater the inertia, and the greater the force needed to move or change the object. So when we look at the inertia of something, we have to ask ourselves how much mass is in that as compared to how much force do we have to place on it in order to move it. You can kind of see it here, where we're looking at the creation of moving a golf ball as compared to moving a truck. And I'll come back to this one in a moment. In other words, the greater the mass, the greater the inertia, and the greater the force needed to move or change the object. The second law is the law of acceleration. So this is the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force causing it, is in the same direction as the force, and is inversely proportional to the mass of the object. What does all this mean? When we place a force on an object, that force will influence the amount of acceleration it goes through. When we place that force on the object, it will move in a direction away from that or in the direction of the force placed on it. The amount that that object moves is completely proportional inversely to how much that object weighs. So obviously, the bigger the object, the more mass we need, or the more energy or force we need in order to move it forward. So in that sense then, the velocity of a pitched ball in baseball reflects the force with which it was thrown and moves in the direction of the line of force at the moment of release. So from a kinesiology analysis point of view, when we watch an individual throw a baseball, it is how much force all that muscle contraction creates by throwing the baseball. And then its point of release out of the hand affects the direction that that ball will move in acceleration due to that force. The other thing is, when we throw that ball, the amount of force that's required to change that ball is completely reliant on how much that ball is moving and how much that ball weighs. So takes less force to stop a ball traveling at 5 meters a second than it does to stop a pitch of 50 meters per second. So when we look at the mass of that thrown ball, the mass of the ball is the measure of its inertia. And the greater the inertia, the more force it takes to change the object's velocity. So there's two things that change the velocity of what this acceleration has caused. How fast that acceleration is affects how much it takes to make change on it. And how much mass that object is that's being moved will affect how much force is required to change it. So the equation is force equals mass and acceleration. So the mass of the object and the amount of acceleration on it creates the amount of force that's there. So we look here. I'm sorry about this. I don't know why this picture all screwed up here. How much force is required to move this ball with this mallet or this putter? How much force is required to move this ball forward? How much force? So force equals acceleration. So it's the amount of force we're required to move the putt a certain distance. So when we're putting a ball, if you've ever played golf, your mind's eye has a look at the target down the green, which is the hole, and through the friction of the grass of the green, the fact that it's an uphill putt or a downhill putt, and how much the mallet weighs, being the putter and the ball, you will calculate the appropriate, or you will attempt to calculate the appropriate amount of force that's required to accelerate that ball the distance you need it to go. Now, if you applied that same force to the ball exactly to the truck, how much would the truck move as compared to the ball? In other words, sufficient force must be applied for an acceleration to occur. So it would be fair to say that the force that you created to move that ball 30 feet would likely have absolutely no effect on that truck, because the mass of that truck is astronomically larger than the golf ball. So we have to take into account, when we're looking at work being done, how much acceleration needs to occur if we're pushing or pulling something, and how do we generate it? The next, or the third law, the last law that I want to talk about today, is the law of reaction. And you've probably heard this one. It's one of the more common laws that's always out there. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So when we think about that, then, the common thing that's used is you're in a boat and you're pushing it one way and everything's moving the other way because you have to have this opposite. Well, if we look at a book lying on a table, that book is under the influence of gravity. So a book lying on a table exerts a downward force on that table, and because the book is stationary, you put it on the table, it's sitting there, it's not moving, there must be another equal and opposite force acting on that book So it lies there and it stays there. And it does. It's the table that creates that force that allows that book to stay there and not move. So because of the first law, when we go back, because of the first law of inertia, we are in a balanced state. Therefore, the downward force of the book is equaling the upward force of the table. So there is no movement. The book sits there without moving, but we say that we have a balanced force. Now, where this comes into play in terms of action-reaction as an example is walking. So when we walk forward, whether it be on the ground or on the beach, whatever it might be, your foot in plantar flexion, when it goes to push off, is actually pushing against the floor or the sand or whatever it might be. And it is pushing against that floor with the same magnitude as the floor pushes back. So therefore you have equal push of the foot to the floor. What happens? We move forward. So we're able to move forward. So the question I have for you is, what happens when we walk on ice and we go to push forward on ice where there's no friction of floor? Do we move forward or does it slide? Without this ability to push forward and get the reverse push back from what we're walking on, we can't move forward. So an example used to the extreme is the sprinter who uses the starting blocks. The starting blocks exude an opposite force that allows the athlete to push forward when they start in a sprint. So we can see here in this picture on the right, the individual's foot, and you will note that here on the diagram, or on the picture, the sand has lifted. Why? Because as the forefoot pushed forward to walk forward, it exuded a force on the sand greater than what the sand could push back. What happened? The sand moved backwards and lifted up. So would it be fair to say that you get more push on asphalt than you do on sand? The other thing we need to think about with these forces is that as important as they are, we also have to think about the fact that these forces can also be the forces that can cause or create injuries. A lot of times when we're looking for injury prevention or to determine from an analysis what's causing the injury, we may want to decrease forces to avoid or limit the injury. The only thing we have to remember that as we attempt to decrease forces, we also decrease the force in the opposite direction. So sometimes we have to consider that maybe it's about strengthening the patient to create more force and so forth. The last sort of formal stuff I want to talk about is something called a lever. Some of you may have gotten this in high school when you're taking your sciences. I know the kin students would have got this as well. I'm not going to be going near as deep in that, but I think we do have to have a discussion in regards to this. What is a lever? It is a rigid bar that can rotate about a fixed point when a force is applied to overcome a resistance. So we have to recognize that we have a bar or an arm, a hard arm, and we have to apply a force to that arm in order to overcome some kind of resistance. When we do this definition of a rigid bar that rotates about a fixed point, an easy example is a bolt that is screwed in tightly and we're using a wrench to loosen off that bolt and unscrew it to do something. That would be a prime example. So when we look at levers, they are mechanically advantageous. So levers are something that man has utilized for a very long time to allow for a mechanical advantage to perform work or tasks. So they serve two important functions. The first is to overcome a resistance larger than the magnitude of the effort applied. So an individual may not be able to move a 1-ton rock, but through the use of a lever and the lever arms and so forth, we actually could conceivably move that rock using the lever where we couldn't possibly do it without the lever. The second function is to increase the speed and range of motion through which a resistance can be moved. So we either create an energy that can move things, or we create and we move something faster than we normally could. So examples, an old-fashioned bottle opener, the big, you put on, you pop it up. A crowbar, a wheelbarrow, or a water hand pump. Each of these really is a rigid bar applied around a fixed point with force. When a force is applied to any of these, it turns about a fixed point known as a fulcrum, also known as an axis, and it overcomes a resistance that may, in some cases, be no more than its own weight. Each of the examples uses a small force to overcome a relatively large resistance in a short distance. So when we're looking at it, could your hand unscrew that bolt? Very likely not. But by taking that wrench and applying an arm length to it, we can use less force to perform the same task than just our hand ourselves. So for example, implements used in sports that are, the other one is overcome large resistance in a short distance. Implements used in sports are levers that do the opposite. So if we think about a golf club, a tennis racket, a baseball bat, etc., these guys aren't about creating massive force in a short range, such as moving the rock. These folks, these tools are used to create a very large range of motion to gain distance at the expense of force. If we take the golf club and we move the golf club through the range of motion, we think about the range of motion of the arm. By placing that shaft of the golf club to the head, we've increased it, that arm length. And through that, we get a far greater range of motion as the body turns through the swing. And as we come back through in the other direction, because of the length of this shaft of the club, it creates speeds with the pros somewhat upwards of 120 miles per hour, which without that implement, the arm twisting to the body couldn't move anywhere near that. So having this lever, like a golf club, it creates a greater distance of movement that the club moves through, therefore equaling a greater speed that's created as the lever moves through. We have anatomical levers. So we have talked in the past about how two bones come together to form a joint, and we have muscles that move that. So when we look at a regular joint, for my example here, the elbow joint, and when we compare the upper arm to the forearm, every bone in the body can be looked at as a rigid arm and therefore a lever. The joint represents the fulcrum or axis of movement, and the contracting muscles that affect that joint are the force. Please remember, I've told you this a couple of times, a muscle does not have an effect on a joint unless it crosses that joint. So you can see here that in this case, the biceps muscle has crossed this fulcrum, and the contraction and shortening of this muscle creates effort or energy or force, and the arm will move about this axis of movement or fulcrum, and the arm itself is a load or anything that the hand actually might be holding in it. Okay, I've alluded to this a couple times and I've talked about arms, so I want to go a little bit more into this. So we have what are called lever arms. We can see here in the diagram, a triangle represents the fulcrum or the axis, and that this long stick, if we wish to call it, goes up and down at the point where it meets the fulcrum. The fulcrum represents a division that occurs. And on either side of this fulcrum, we have different names for the arms. So, commonly defined as the portion of the lever between the fulcrum and the force points. When I say force points, if we put a load on this end, it is applying a force that is the weight of the load. If I want to move this upwards, this load upwards along this arm, I have to perform another form of energy to push on this side of the fulcrum in order to have this side travel upwards. So It's commonly defined as the portion of the lever between the fulcrum and the force points. The effort arm is the distance between the fulcrum and the effort point. So the effort arm here is where you might be applying pressure in order to raise up this weight. The resistance arm is the distance between the fulcrum and the resistance point. In this case, in the diagram, the artist has placed a box here that represents a particular load. Let's say it's 5 kilograms. So this side of the fulcrum is called the load arm, containing the load, the weighted box of 5 kilograms. And this side of the arm, on this side of the fulcrum, the energy or the effort that you would have to create to move this is known as the effort arm. There are a number of arrangements between the effort, the load, and the fulcrum. In fact, there are 3 different arrangements. So there are a number of arrangements that can occur between the 3 points of a lever. The moment or effort arm, so yes, the effort arm is occasionally called the moment arm. The fulcrum, which is the axis, or the point where things move around, and the resistance or the load arm. So you can see in this diagram, there is this kind of configuration with the fulcrum in the center and both energies on either side. We have this kind of lever where we have the fulcrum at this end and both the load and the effort are on the same side as compared to the fulcrum. And then we have a third class lever which is showing the fulcrum here and the effort in between the load and the fulcrum. And we're going to review these and go through all 3 of them. So the first, if we go back, is the first class lever, which is this one here. The axis or the fulcrum lies between the effort and the resistance. The effort and the load or the resistance. The mechanical advantage here is balance. It can also be used to magnify the effects of the effort or to increase the speed or range of motion on the basis of the relative lengths of the effort arm and the moment arm. So when we look back here in this first class lever, quite often artists will, in terms of learning these levers, show you the fulcrum here dead in the center with equal length on either side. The reality is we can move this fulcrum, as long as it stays between the effort and the load, we can move this fulcrum in either direction, and depending on where this is, has an effect on the effort load and the effort and the load itself. So how much effort is required versus how much load there is has a big emphasis on changing that, and we're going to get back to that later. So it can also be used to magnify the effects of the effort or to increase the speed or range of motion on the basis of the relative lengths of the effort arm and the moment arm. So for example, a seesaw, which you see there, a balance scale, or a pair of scissors is actually a lever where you have the resistance of the paper that the blades are cutting, the fulcrum where the 2 blades come together, and then the effort, which is where your fingers are, that close the 2 circles together. Flexion and extension of the head on the C-spine is also an example of a first-class lever. So when we look at the head on the C-spine, I'll give you a moment here to think about where is the resistance or the effort in this example and where is the load. In other words, what is happening if resistance is forcing the head in a particular direction versus how we prevent the chin, say, from coming down on the chest? You can see it here first in the regular diagram. We have the fulcrum at the center with the force on one side that's going against the load. Okay. What we see here is force and load here. So the fulcrum would be at this point between the C1 and occiput. The resistance is the weight of the head because it wants to fall forward because this mass is anterior to the C1 occipital relationship. And then the muscles, splenius capitis for example, has to have applied force to hold the head up directly. So we see that lifting the head up to a straight position along this fulcrum represents a first-class lever where the muscles are bringing the head back to neutral. The second is the second-class lever. In this lever, the resistance lies between the axis and the effort, which we can see here. load and the applied force, and the fulcrum is here at the end. We can also see it here, fulcrum, load, and force. So repeat. This lever, the resistance lies between the axis and the effort. The effort arm is always longer than the resistance arm in this type of lever. The effort arm is always longer than the resistance arm in this lever. For example, this type of lever magnifies the effects of the effort, so it takes less effort to move the resistance. Prime example is a wheelbarrow. We have the axis, the wheel at the front. We have the bin of the wheelbarrow that contains all the rocks, stones, sand, whatever might be carrying it. And then we apply against the force of what's in the bin to lift the wheelbarrow up to move it forward. If you look at how much weight we can put in a wheelbarrow, which allows us to move it, if I were to place that kind of weight in your arms to carry, you couldn't ever possibly carry it. So the wheelbarrow is actually magnifying your effort to be able to carry that massive increase in weight that's being carried in the bin of the wheelbarrow. Another one is a door. So actually we're applying effort at the door knob as compared to the hinge being the fulcrum or the axis. Another example is a nutcracker, where we have the two pieces coming together with the nut being in the center. An example of a second-class lever is kind of controversial in the kinesiology world. Some feel that an example of a second-class lever is when the foot is being plantar flexed in a weight-bearing position. So the fulcrum point is at the point of ground contact. The effort is at the heel where the Achilles tendon attaches, and the force is actually the weight of the body. So first of all, let's have a look here. In a second-class lever, the fulcrum is found away or on the other side of the load away from the applied force. So here's the fulcrum. We have the load here with the applied force. So we can say the load arm is short and the applied force is always longer. Here's the wheelbarrow. We have the fulcrum, the load, and the applied force. What some anatomists suggest that in this foot, when we're on the ground and we're lifting our heel up in plantar flexion, the floor would be here pointing up, that we have our fulcrum here at the carpal metacarpal joints. We have the active force here by the muscle contraction lifting the heel up, and the resistance down is the actual weight of the entire body pushing down on this ankle joint, lifting up. The last one is a third-class lever. In this case, the effort lies between the axis and the resistance, which we can see here. The force lies between the axis and the resistance. In this lever, the resistance arm is always greater as compared to the rest of the other arms. This results in the creation of greater effort to overcome a given resistance. This is not the most efficient in terms of being able to deal with large weights or large force, but what's more important about this type of lever is that very small motion of effort ends up in creating large movement within the resistance. Repeat, a very small motion by the effort results in a large movement in the resistance. Therefore, we can say that this lever, this third-class lever, is about speed and increased range of motion at the expense of force. Right? It's not going to be efficiently as creating force as the first and second class, but the first and second class do not create the same kind of speed, nor do they create the same kind of range of motion. This is why this is the most common type of lever in the human body. Most relationships between resistance, muscle force created, and axis of movement, fulcrum, is a third-class lever in the body. So we can see here is the example of the first class in the body. Here is the example of the second class, what we just went through in the body. But here's an example of the third class, which we can see over here. A third class has the force between the resistance and the axis. So if we look at the biceps here, we have our axis here being the elbow joint. We have our resistance. In this case, the artist has the person holding a bit of a weight here of resistance. And then the force is created by the shortening of the muscle to move this arm in the one direction. So this is an example of a third-class lever in the human body. And as I said, it is the most common class of lever in the human body. Any lever balances when the product of the effort and the effort arm equals the product of the resistance and the resistant arm. In other words, if we have balance, if we have equal resistance to equal creation of force and there's no movements, this is said to be balanced. And this is the principle of levers. When we have a principle of levers, we're able to calculate the amount of effort that's needed to balance a known resistance by means of a known lever, or to calculate the point at which to place the fulcrum in order to balance a known resistance with a given effort. So we can move things around when we start looking at the work that needs to be done. And we start to act upon it by, we have created tools, for example, as a culture, and so forth. So in other words, when we look at the equation, effort times the effort arm equals resistance times the resistance arms. This gives us balance, and is from here, from this point, that we can make calculations to determine where to place effort, resistance, and fulcrum to perform whatever the task might be. Moving quickly, large range of motion, or creating an amount of force to move an object with the least amount of work by, say, an individual. This principle also shows the importance of lever arm lengths in determining the amount of effort needed to balance a given resistance. If the effort arm is lengthened, while the resistance times the resistance arm remains constant, the amount of effort required to balance must decrease. If the resistance arm increases, the effort must increase. Where does this work? So let's use, for example, a sit-up, a very normal everyday sit-up. If I put my hands on the floor down by my bum and I attempt to lift my chest up off the floor, my resistance arm is from my hips to my shoulders. If I were to place my hands on my head, I have increased the resistance arm by the length of my shoulders to my head. Therefore, because my resistance arm is longer, I have to create more force in order to lift up to do a sit-up. The last point would be, is if I took my arms and I reached up above my head while on the floor, my resistance arm then would be from my hips all the way to my fingertips, and I would have to create even more resistance to do a sit-up in order to move the chest up, creating way more force even again to move that chest up off the floor towards the knees. Now, if the effort arm is lengthened, then I can produce less force to do the work. So this results in a third-class lever requiring more effort than the resistance they must balance or move. So this is where we start to think about what kind of resistance does a patient need to create in order to perform a task. Quite often in my past, when I've looked at this, when a patient comes to me and maybe has like a chronic tendonitis or something along that line, when I start to look at the task that's required, and I look at it from a perspective of a third-class lever, and I recognize that the body needs a particular amount of force in order to perform the task, I may look at a patient and realize that patient cannot create that force, and they're using poor postures or other kinds of movements to make the work function properly. This is what helps me discover why a patient is injured. That you need to maybe, in this kind of patient, say you need to get a whole lot stronger because you need to create a lot more force in order to perform the task. So when a lever has an effort arm longer than the moment arm to first or second class levers, it's said to have favor force. In other words, here you can see the example, the longer stick to move the rock. So if I had the effort arm very short here, this individual would find it very difficult to move this rock. But by creating a longer effort arm, this individual doesn't need to apply near as much force to mechanically move this rock over. Make that effort arm longer, then work becomes easier, but speed and range are reduced. A lever whose resistance arm is longer, whether a first class or third class lever, favors speed and distance. The best I can give to you is the golf swing. When we look at the club in relationship to the arm here, we can say that golf swing lengthens the anatomical arm. So from the shoulder all the way down to the club head represents the lengthening of this moment arm. The resistance arm. So by doing this, by lengthening this, we have increased range of motion. See how much farther the club has gone here as compared to this gentleman's arms. And then when he comes down to strike the ball, he increases speed, which therefore upon impact and the laws around acceleration creates a far greater force on this ball, which has the ball move in the direction of the force placed on it, farther out into the fairway. If we go back to the acceleration law, this is where the problem always lies in golf, is where this club face hits this ball is going to push that ball by the law of acceleration in whatever direction that impact hits. And obviously from a golfer's perspective, you would like to have the face of this club hit this ball in a beautiful straight line so that it pushes the ball in the direction you want it to go. So the thing to remember then about this type of lever is the greater the range, the greater the speed, and the greater effect on the acceleration of this device striking and accelerating the ball. So why do all this for massage? Why have all this, what we just talked about, for massage? I can tell you that this is where it's going to help you. It's going to help you in creating remedial exercise for the patient, because part of a remedial exercise is listening to what the patient is expected to do functionally for their work or play. It's going to help you with that. It's going to help you interpret assessment results. So when you're looking at, again, the work that needs to be done compared to what you're seeing in, say, the range of motion of joints or the strength of joints, it's going to help you interpret better what's happening there. It's going to help you with functional abilities evaluations. So when a patient is telling you they have to do a particular type of work or job or play, you may be evaluating the functional abilities of that. It's going to help you understand what's required there. It's going to help you understand these activities of daily living as well, of what this patient's telling you. You can actually start to break things down to say, what is required to vacuum a carpet properly? Someone has a bad back. Maybe vacuuming is the worst thing they can do, because when you start looking at the angles of forces that are placed on the back to simply vacuum a carpet, you start to understand where, through these kinesiological movements and these laws, where struggles start to happen for patients. Interpreting functional requirements. This is definitely going to help you understand what's required on the job, what's required in the sport they play, what's required in their actions at home when they're working. So all in all of this is really going to help you understand in creating remedial exercise, functional exercises for your patient to perform better, whether that be work, play, or life. Thanks for listening. There's more to come. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we'll talk soon.